Hi, I'm a high school student and I was given an account that gives me access to all of the Adobe apps. I was trying to use Photoshop and Adobe After Effects, and it would tell me that my access had expired, even though I should have access until I finished high school. My students have been locked out of their Adobe accounts for the entire course, which is now near the end. I'm getting a new batch of students late in January. The resolution process has not worked for me. I gave up trying because I could not get anywhere. I reached out here as a last resort out of desperation. This process is broken. I looked to see what we could do to upgrade, and there's only a $500 difference between 10 licenses and 100. That is a little ridiculous. The pricing just shows how Adobe dislikes small schools. If you're not rich, you can't use it. For the first month of spring 2022 semester, Bluefield University graphics communication students were not able to access and use essential Adobe graphic design software in a Mac lab in BU's Science Center, causing a number of challenges and delays for the students in completing coursework. School is back in session and Adobe is really frustrating me. This happens every year. Adobe Software, it used to be installed on the computers, and if a student wanted to use the software, they'd sit down, open up a file, and they'd start working. And then about 2018, 2019, they changed that. They changed that to a login. So now the students have to log in before they gain access to the software. The biggest benefit of this was that the students had access to the software at home. They could also sit down at any computer, log in, and if they uploaded their files to the cloud, they had access. But the downside is pretty significant. Now, I've already related a story on this channel about how the internet was down on the day of finals. And the students showed up, I was there, we were ready to go, we had power, turn on the computers, but the students couldn't log into the Adobe software, so we had to cancel the final exam. It was very frustrating. Now, what's happening right now is what happens every year. It's probably happened for the past 4-5 years maybe, is we come to class and the students don't have access to the Adobe software. It's supposed to come free with the class. Students sign up months in advance, but then we arrive to class on the day of class and they can't get in. Well, apparently what happens is my school submits the class roster. But then on the first day of class, 95% of my students don't have access to the software. So they have to go through this long thing where they take a screenshot and they send it to IT, and IT has to manually send each and every one of these things to Adobe to confirm that the student's in class. I speculate this is Adobe's way of mucking things up in a way that kind of forces students who can afford to just buy the software. Most of my students do not have that luxury. So we end up going 2 weeks without the software. Now, another problem arises is some students will unwittingly sign up for a 7-day trial and not realize that they're using that 7-day trial. So then a week later, when we come back to class, they find out that they don't have access to Photoshop anymore. So then they have to go through that process of getting reinstated. Process will take 2 to 3 days before they can get in. So now we're a couple of weeks back and we're still not running Photoshop. The other problem with the 7-day trials is some students will give them a credit card. And when that happens, I tell them, look, just go cancel that 7-day trial right now. I don't want to take a chance because once they sign you up, you're into a year contract. So you're in deep. I haven't found much on YouTube about this problem, but Tom Buck is a former teacher, and I started watching him in 2020 when he was still a teacher, and he eventually switched over to a full-time YouTuber, and he was doing a live Q&A. I was watching a recorded version of this, and my fingers were crossed that someone asked his opinion about Adobe, about this whole Adobe being sued by the federal government. And I was pleased when someone asked the question. This is Tom Buck. He's one of my favorite YouTubers. He used to be a high school teacher, and he says he would have to start the process of renewing the Adobe licenses about 5 months before they expired to try to prevent a lapse in service. He would have to set up hundreds of individual accounts, he says. And when he left that job, he says about 20% of his time at work was spent administering Adobe accounts. He still says that the Adobe products are awesome in spite of the problems. And I'll leave a link below in the description if you want to go see exactly what he said. So Tom has no affinity for Affinity. I understand that. There are a lot of professionals that prefer to have the software that can do everything. And as I have read in the comments, there are certain things that some professionals cannot live without, that novices or beginners or even semi-pros or even professionals can live without, depending on what they do. So what I'm showing you right now is how I do the same thing within Photopea, Affinity Photo, and Photoshop. So you can see this early assignment that I do, it can be done, and the skills can be learned. There might be a bit of a learning curve when you switch over to Photoshop if you do become a professional, but if you never become a professional, you already own your software. You don't have to keep sinking money into this endless pit. But there are sticking points for professionals. I am not arguing that. What I am arguing is students can use this. They can afford this. And they give it free for kids in high school. So that is a no-brainer. When you can just sit down, you never have to go through any of these hassles. I just don't see why schools aren't adopting this more. Well, I do see why schools aren't adopting this more. The reason they're not adopting this more is because there's that stigma of it not being the industry standard. But my argument here is, if professional pilots use simulators, why can't this be our simulator? Why can't this be the testing ground to learn those skills? But here, I just want to show you a video of a pilot talking about do flight simulators work. And if you want to think of some of these lesser softwares as being flight simulators or design simulators, think of it that way. So I'm just going to play you a little bit from this guy. He's a pilot, Brodie Brazil, and just flip the words when he's talking about a plane. Just think about it as design or illustration or photography. Here we go.
So I've been a pilot since 2004 and a flight instructor since 2008. And over all those years, there's a common question that always comes up. And the question goes like this: should I get into playing Microsoft Flight Simulator or something similar? Will that help my actual flight training and my actual path into becoming a private pilot? My answer, I'll just give it away. It's easy. It's a definitive yes. And what I want to explain are the two reasons why that answer is yes. Number one, as it usually is money. And you can't compare them to the hundreds of hours you could spend playing a game like this and getting the most out of it, getting all the experience out of it.
Again, this is a reason why I think schools should switch to Affinity. The skills that they learn in Affinity Photo will transfer, and you don't have to have that hassle. So now I'm teaching Affinity Photo, Photopea, because Photoshop can't get its act together.